Carving up the uncarved. It might still seem as if I'm suggesting that we live in two worlds, but they are actually the same world. One is the absolute nature of this reality, of which we are generally ignorant. The other is the relative nature of this same reality. This is the world that we know. Just as a way to think about the matter, we could say metaphorically that one is like an infinite uncarved block, and the other is what's carved out of the block. Without carving the block into pieces, the uncarved block cannot be perceived in any way, since there is nothing to perceive and no one to perceive it. The carving, or making of distinctions, creates a relative world, and so perception becomes possible as well as necessary for life. In this imagery, we can see that although these two domains, representing the absolute and the relative, seem to be different, the nature or substance of both is identical. We're simply ignorant of this nature. We only experience the carving. If we move closer to the truth, still using the metaphor imagery to ground us, we can begin to entertain the fact that consciousness or existence in its absolute form is the uncarved block. This means everything relative, such as self, objects, bodies, awareness, and everything else that exists or could possibly exist, is of this same nature. They are forms of existence or consciousness. They are simply limited forms of absolute existence because they are finite and are distinct. They have boundaries and, by definition, are not whatever they are not. That makes them relative. But consider the possibility that absolute consciousness, which is the same as absolute existence, is still the very nature of everything that is relative. It just shows up as limitation, because we only perceive or experience the relative, since it's the only thing that can be perceived. We are restricted to knowing only these limitations. Stopping there, however, we fail to grasp the infinite or absolute nature that is the foundation for it all. Where the metaphor falls short is the fact that our imagined infinite uncarved block is actually relative, because we can't actually imagine infinity. All we can do is, at best, produce a conceptual image of some infinite objective substance. If this substance is infinite, however, and all that is, it doesn't stop anywhere or have any boundaries at all, so there is no way to perceive or experience it. Being infinite, it can have no location or space or substance, because it actually can't exist as anything relative in any way. That is what the carving is all about. Yet, when it is carved up, then there is one thing and another, and they are finite because they do stop somewhere. In this way, one element can perceive another. As one of those elements, we can perceive the carved up stuff. But we are only perceiving the carving itself, in other words, the outside of the substance at the point of distinction, but not the substance itself. As with our uncarved block, we don't experience the real substance of existence, just the distinctions that are made out of this substance, the limitations that arise when carved up in order to create something. Can you follow this? On the other hand, without the carving, there is no need to perceive anything because it is all one, or actually none. There is nothing to perceive, and so no function for it to serve. Not to mention, once again, that in this case, perception is not possible. Beyond the analogy, try to imagine that all of this complex existence of space and objects and life is, in some unimaginable way, arises and shares the same nature as an absolute consciousness that itself has no aspect or element. At the same time, don't confuse anything that can be thought or imagined as the absolute. To use another analogy, start by acknowledging that space must be infinite. Even though we can't conceive of this infinite nature, we see it encompasses, and it will always encompass everything objective. Although we can only see the objects in front of us, we also grasp that space is as much a part of the object as it is of empty space. Space fills everywhere, whether in the form of an object or in the form of the absence of objects. In other words, the distance between objects. Yet, what is the real nature of space? Concentrate on this for a moment and experience that the nature of space includes all that you perceive in the objective world. Yet the absolute nature of space is overlooked and not what you think or take for granted. Even as you think about infinite space, you really just imagine great distances with a concept that it goes on forever. But this is not grasping the real nature of infinity. If you acknowledge space must be infinite and therefore absolute, that should change your sense of its nature a great deal. Although you can't picture or imagine infinite space, you can grasp that it must go on forever. Since if it stops somewhere, what is on the other side of that? So you can see it can't ever stop. You just can't conceive of it not stopping. There is really no way to get around it. Even if it is inconceivable by the mind, you must conclude that space includes all of objective existence and yet isn't itself relative. It is infinite. Don't confuse the distance between objects as space. That is relative. Space is the context that allows for objects and distance to exist. Therefore, this nature, like the nature of the uncarved block, is absolute and without character or relativity. It really is absolutely nothing. And that is how it can be infinite. Grasp that because infinity can't have boundaries or distinctions, it has no location or element. It doesn't stop anywhere and yet contains all that does stop. What would you call this nature? Nothing is as close of a word as I can come up with. Although you can't imagine infinity and so can't imagine the real nature of space, it presses you in a direction that requires deeper contemplation. Just so, I'm asserting that existence or consciousness is infinite and is the nature of it all. And so we can't imagine the real nature of what I'm calling consciousness either. This consciousness is not restricted to awareness or mind. It is infinite in possibility because it is the blank slate, so to speak, upon which existence can occur. But just as I call the nature of infinity nothing, I'm calling the nature of existence a consciousness that shares this same absolute nothing nature. Don't get hung up on the names. They are just the best I can do using the English language to point to something inconceivable and not found within the language. Our difficulty in grasping this lies in the fact that all of our thinking, imagining, and perceiving exists solely within the relative. Here we will always hold the absolute and relative as different realities. What we're missing is the fact that we're not talking about a different reality, but the very nature of all reality. Our problem is simply not being fully conscious of this source nature of existence. Since existence manifests only as the relative, this is what we perceive. But think about it. Although we tend to think of the absolute as rather ethereal, not practical, or grounded in objective reality, we can see that the absolute remains and is unshakable no matter what happens or what exists or changes in the relative. Just as with our infinity analogy, we see infinity as completely unchanged no matter what occurs or doesn't occur within objective existence. All of our perceived reality could turn to dust and it wouldn't in any way change the absolute, which is unchangeable. Everything that exists relatively is only one of infinite possibilities. There is no end to the possibilities of carving up the blocks, so to speak. If something can be done one way, it can be done another. That means relativity is also infinite, and infinity is an absolute. The absolute is the only constant in the universe and is impossible to alter or change in any way because there is nothing at all to change. Every element of existence must arise from no element. Can you see that? The fact of relativity, the existence of elements and aspects, doesn't in any way change the absolute nothing or no element in which it takes place. Since this possibility must have no distinct element, we could call it nothing. Yet this nothing is not the absence of something, nor is it in contrast to something or to everything. There's actually nothing we're talking about here. It doesn't exist. It is the nature of existence. All of existence is relative. One, two, none, more, everything, something else are all distinctions in the relative domain. As a matter of fact, every possibility in the entire universe and beyond, and every possibility to come, will always exist within the relative. The most universal and grand event or possibility is still relative. That's what makes it universal and grand, because it's not specific and mundane. Anytime we imagine or experience another possibility or reality, we've already created relativity no matter what it is we imagine or experience. The absolute is simply the nature of it all. We just may not be conscious of that fact. We can't say that the nature of existence is something new or different or something at all, even though it is the nature of everything that is. This really leaves us with no distinct possibility. Since this possibility must have no distinct element, we could call it nothing. This is difficult to grasp. That is why I use the metaphor of the uncarved block.